Hey everyone, it is me again, Teresa, and I decided to do another video. Just helps me learn the information, I guess. So this is my demonstration, essentially, of visible learning for you. So here we go. Module 7, Creating a Culture of Thinking and Visible Learning. Our first topic was important cultural forces. So we looked at Richard's work, and I actually have a copy of the book that Dr. Anderson gave us a summary of, the Creating Cultures of Thinking. And I picked 4 of the 8 forces he talks about to discuss with you all. So the first one that I find particularly important is modeling. So from his book, Who We as Teachers Are, as Thinkers and Learners is what modeling is. This squares with my perception of being true to myself and authentic in front of my students in that I am a thinker, I am a learner. Our students always take note of this disposition and what we are displaying to them. And thirdly, Richard describes this idea of cognitive apprenticeship. So we think about modeling typically in the classroom instructionally, but he talks about how we can basically become more of an expert by acquiring not only the skills we see of experts, but particularly how they think, work through problems, make judgments, identify issues, their decision-making style, and so this idea of our students modeling those similar ways that we think through things also. Secondly, I had interactions as being a great force in creating this culture of thinking. I have actually had these 3 terms, listen, learn, and lead, in my classroom, and I call it the 3 L's in my classroom. Richard describes listening and questioning as the basis of our interactions with our students. Hattie also displays that student and teacher interactions are very high in relation to the success and achievement of students, with his effect size score of 0.72 there. And Richard actually referenced Hattie's work in his 8 forces, or creating culture of thinking. And also with that, Project Zero's thinking routine has lots of great stuff in their toolbox to kind of help build these interactions. And one I've recently touched on is this 3-2-1 bridge idea. So I will just briefly show you the toolbox. And I have this linked in my presentation if anybody just wants to look at it, but it gives you all sorts of thinking types and routines, and I particularly like their ideas for introducing and exploring ideas, but there are lots of ways to search and clear and go into the filters. So 3-2-1 bridge is where I found that one, and it's just this idea of 3 questions you might have, 2 thoughts, and sorry, you have to go to the resource link there. And so 3 thoughts or ideas, 2 questions, and 1 metaphor. Got that wrong. So the toolbox is great. Check that out if any of you are able to. Lots of good ideas if you're needing maybe something new to freshen that up. And we can move on to routines. I feel like the 4 I picked are all really interconnected. So Richard describes routines as being more than just the managerial type, but including thinking and learning structures. So I think that goes actually with those interactions a lot, those thinking routines that Project Zero has come up with. And to be honest, this has been kind of a current struggle for me as a new teacher with COVID and hybrid. So it's all been trial and error. Richard suggests that there's 4 categories for routines in the classroom and in thinking. One is the management style, 2 is an instructional routine, which I think is what I've struggled with. Interactional, which I just mentioned, going back to Project Zero, and then thinking routines, which I think ties into modeling. So all these 8 forces he talks about really do kind of interconnect with each other. Thinking routines, he says, are habits. They can be taught, they can be modeled through that cognitive apprenticeship idea. Project Zero says it is best to stick to one core thinking routine initially and really develop that and hone in on that before you move on to maybe some other type of thinking routine. And I think particularly for me, teaching high school freshmen in science, that's something I felt like I needed to try different things, but maybe I just needed to focus on doing one well. So trial and error, I am learning as well right there with my students. Lastly, that environment, using the space to support learning and thinking. Each room in my school has kind of a unique culture, I guess is the way to put it, or a unique visual components to it. I particularly am drawn to this biology teacher who's been there for 20-some years, and she's got all the Kansas native grasses on the wall and lots of student artwork, and Richard again gives these 4 fronts. So he likes to work in numbers, and he says that the environment should have some visibility, flexibility, comfort, and an inviting quality for students. And with visibility, he was talking about the visibility of student work as well. One thing that this draws me back to is our idea of sustainability and how a lot of us mentioned we would love for more of the outdoor environment for education. So a thought that Richard kind of brings up and that always comes back to my mind is that money continues to dominate the physical layout of the school, but this environment of thinking and learning isn't just in the classroom, it's also in the mind. So moving on, I watched the Music to Save Music video, and I noticed the teacher tying into these concepts of Richard's work, the 8 forces, almost every single one of them in the video, to be honest. So I listed the 6 that I saw the most here, and I thought that the teacher said it best when he talked about how the environment in his classroom was changing by allowing his students to create their own music. And I believe they were 4th and 5th grade students. So I just jotted down all the things that I noticed him doing, and I think particularly the teacher felt best about this freedom he was giving his students and how it changed his environment, not the physical environment, but I think he was referring to the mental environment and how his students were thinking more and really creating and collaborating. Hattie's work on visible learning was interesting, and I noticed the major concepts as being that teachers want to help students improve, and we need to improve this learning process in the head and make things visible for our students, and that the teacher's mind frame of our role is really crucial to making learning visible. In my own classroom, this has influenced me, reading his work, noticing that student expectation was actually a lot higher on the effect size scale. My students don't necessarily show or verbalize a lot of expectation out of me, but I thought it was really interesting to notice that they might be thinking opposite of what I think they think. Also, peer tutoring was something that was up on the effect size scale, and I don't do a lot of that, but I think that is something that would be like a healthy addition to my classroom culture and thinking. Lastly, some cautions in the work was that Hattie states his work is not, supposed to just go ahead and change everything. It's to begin discussions. They mention class size and performance pay as a caution also, not necessarily things to go by as far as developing culture of thinking or thinking in students, critical thinking. And there was this interpretation of small versus big differences, being cautionary about his effect size number and that hinge point, that even a small difference effect size wise is still a difference to a student. It doesn't have to be a large effect size number that you're going for. Even a small one can make an impact. As a new teacher, honestly, it's hard to see myself currently, as a leader to improving curriculum. I'm trying to still get a grasp on some of the curriculum stuff. But some Australian research I read about said that a great deal of school success depends on the areas the educational leader chooses to spend time. And this is something that my department in building has really been thinking a lot about. This success of our students and really our staff and how we practice the instruction, training we receive, and learning. We've talked a lot about modeling, and not just modeling instructionally, but also my mentor teacher thought the best way for a teacher to learn was to seriously just be an apprentice to, a seasoned teacher, which is kind of that cognitive apprenticeship that Richard had mentioned. So if there was any way to incorporate more of that into teacher training, I would love to, kind of lead that, or maybe lead the cause for it. Australian research also suggested that a community of learners is necessary for schools to succeed. And I think the heart of improving curriculum is really letting teachers have that community more than just a professional development day, but more of a, long, maybe we're even all in a class, if you want to call it that, together. I also thought it was interesting to note on Hattie's website, Visible Learning 2018 numbers collective teacher efficacy was the highest in effect size to student achievement or student outcome. And I think that really ties back into this community of teachers being a community of professional learners. And if we're going to be leaders in curriculum, we need to have that community with each other. Not that we don't, but we can definitely improve on that. And if we improve our community, we can improve how we teach and kind of get that collective teacher efficacy working better for students. Lastly, I looked at the self-assessment question number 9. How would you describe the most characteristic features of student thinking in your classroom? I, again, am coming into education at an interesting time and have noticed a lot of this, learned helplessness and spoon-fed answers to my students. Of the 96 responses, I think I counted that right, to this question, around 10 gave that answer. And this is just, the first thing that comes to your mind kind of question. 10, on the flip side, said critical thinking was, the characteristic feature of their classroom. So I thought it was interesting that 10% of the responses almost, and another 10% gave those two kind of opposite answers. How can I use this in my classroom? I've noticed this trend, and my goal is to get students past this learned helplessness, or the only way to answer is to Google something, by teaching them that technology is simply the tool. It is not the machine. The brain is still the machine there. Lastly, my big question is, what are some physical space designs or ideas you have to support thinking in your classroom? I assume most of you have a very traditional room like myself, so I'm just curious if anybody has some kind of unique pockets for thinking there. And here are my references. Thanks for listening, everybody.